This is the newly redesigned Transition Sentinel version 3 to be specific. The Sentinel used to be Transition's main enduro bike until they came out with the Spire. So version 1 was 150 travel in the front, 140 in the back. Version 2, they increased the travel to 160 in the front, 150 in the back, but they also made that bike pretty slack. Now that they have the Spire, they've made version 3 to be a bit more of an all-arounder. It's still 160 travel in the front, 150 in the back, but they've steepened the head angle to 64 degrees. They made some other geo tweaks just to make this bike a bit more agile and, again, a bit more of an all-arounder. You can get the Sentinel in alloy or carbon. They have 2 complete alloy models starting at $3,300 for a Dayor equipped model, and you can get an XT, Shimano XT model. The carbon comes in 3 complete builds, and then of course you can get a frame set, both alloy and carbon. This is their top of the line SRAM XO transmission. It weighs about 33 pounds, and I've been riding this bike for about 3 weeks now, and I can tell you it is really, really sweet. You can also run this as a mullet bike. There's a flip chip, which you would put in the high position if you want to put on a 27.5-inch wheel. Make it even more playful. The one here is full 29, so the flip chip, which I'll show here in a minute, is in the low position. I'm not going to go too much into the components. There are a few I want to mention on this bike, but because I want to review the Transition as a whole bike, I want it to apply to all the models. So let's take a close-up look at this particular bike, and then I'll talk about how the bike rides. The frames now have these cable ports, which allow you to easily put the cables inside the frame. If you didn't have any cables going on either side of the down tube, you can plug them up to make it cleaner. I'll go ahead and mention here that you can now get the Sentinel in a gloss white paint, which I love. I think this is the first Sentinel that you can get with a gloss paint job. I really like glossy frames. They've had some pretty cool paint colors in the past, but this is my pick, this gloss white. I mentioned the internal storage, and the way this works is you just undo this lever. It is below the water bottle, and that has the advantage of not having to remove the water bottle when it's time to access the internal storage, and it also keeps things from rattling around because you don't have all that weight on the actual door. All of the frames come with a FID lock mounting system. So the way this bottle works is you simply twist it to get it off, and it's got magnets if you're not familiar with it. They don't come with the water bottle itself, but they do come with the base so that you can use a FID lock water bottle. There is a mud guard to keep junk from getting inside your frame there and potentially damaging it. Very similar to the dirt skirt that I reviewed on my channel recently. There is the flip chip that I mentioned. Again, you would run it in the high position for a 27.5-inch wheel, and then the low position. Now, of course, you could put it in the high position with a 29er, but it's really designed to allow the bike to be converted into a mullet bike. All Sentinel models come with a Maxxis Assegai 2.5 in the front, and then a Maxxis Minion DHR 2 in the rear. It's a 2.4. I'll talk more about the tires when I talk about how the bike rides, because it does really play into how it climbs as well as how it descends. The length of the dropper post that you get with the Sentinel is going to depend on the frame size. This is a medium. I'm 5'8", in case that is helpful for you, and I felt this bike fit me really, really well. But this one comes with a 170 dropper post. A large comes with a 200 mil dropper post, and a small comes with a 150. And then extra small is 125, and extra large extra large is a 230. 170 is very generous, and I really like a 170 dropper on my bikes because when you're descending some pretty gnarly stuff, it's nice to get that saddle just completely down and out of the way. You do have a newly redesigned chainstay protector on this bike that really reduces chain slap, and it does work. This was a very quiet descending bike. Like version 1 and version 2 of the Sentinel, this one is a horse link, which puts the rear pivot on the chainstay. And if you're not familiar with a horse link, it's one of the best designs to decouple braking from suspension. In other words, as you're coming down a hill over really rough stuff and you're hard on the rear brake, the suspension does not stiffen up. There is a guide on the back of the frames that lets you know how much sag to run. So if you've got this set up stock, which is a 150 millimeter travel shock, 60 millimeter stroke, you can run it 16 to 20 millimeters of sag, increase it to 160. It's got the guide there so that you dial in the sag appropriately. Now let's talk about how this bike rides, starting with the climbing. One of the things that Transition have done to make this bike a very capable climber is steepen the seat tube angle, the effective seat tube angle. And when I say steepen, this is the steepest seat tube angle that I have ever ridden on a bike. The medium that I'm riding here is a 78.7 degree effective seat tube angle. Now, if you put a 27.5 inch wheel on it, it will go to 78.3, but that is pretty steep. And what that does is it really allows the bike to be controllable, because 64 degrees is still fairly slack. And so if the bike is just so slack with a slack seat tube angle, the front end is going to be hard to control. I can say definitely the bike feels like the front end is very manageable. I rode it up some like 20+% grades, and I honestly did not have the front wheel wandering around. Now, when I first got on this bike, it was actually on my local cross-country trails just to get this bike dialed in. And I had been riding my gravel bike a bunch, and when I got on it, man, I felt like the handlebars were in my belly button. Now, I had not been riding mountain bikes for a while because of the storms destroying the trails. But after I got used to it, it was fine. But if you're coming from a bike that's really stretched out, getting on a bike like this with a steep seat tube angle, you're going to feel like the bars are pretty close to you. Now, this bike really is made, even though we call it an all-arounder, it is really made for either climbing or descending. You can ride it on flowy trails, no problem. The main difference is you're going to feel like you're a bit more forward, and you're going to feel the weight of the bike. So climbing on this bike is good. It's still, you can still feel the weight. So I mentioned the tires earlier. So 2.5 and a 2.4, pretty beefy tires. Now, when you're going downhill, the tires are awesome. But when you're climbing, you can really feel the weight hold you back just because they're big tires. I jumped on my spur, which I own a transition spur with carbon wheels. Felt like it had a motor in it after riding this bike, because a bike like this is simply not going to accelerate like a lighter, shorter travel bike. So you just got to keep that in mind. It's going to climb well. It's not going to just jump over roots and rocks as you're climbing. It's just a steady climber to get you to the top so that the bike will really rip on the descents, and it rips on the descents. It's agile, it's playful for, you know, a bike with this much travel. And, you know, like I said, Transition have changed some of the geo numbers so that it can be more playful. So I felt that on the descents, I could move the bike around obstacles, rocks, roots, or just ride right over them. This bike has, to me, the perfect amount of travel for an all-arounder in the mountains. I love climbing on my spur. Like it is my favorite climbing bike, but on the descents, the Sentinel, it's just amazing. When I hit like really like consecutive rocks and consecutive roots, I never felt like the suspension was packing up. They designed the frame to ride higher in its travel so that when you hit the bigger stuff, the bike just absorbs it. Because this is a demo, it's not my bike, I didn't really get a chance to mess around with volume spacers. I want to do that once I get one in my fleet, but I didn't even, like, even though I set the sag appropriately, I didn't even get full travel on this bike because I felt like I really could take out some volume spacers. I don't do a lot of like big jumps or big drops. So because of that, I typically will remove volume spacers to make the travel more linear. I can say, as it sits right now, the bike was plenty plush. I hit some, you know, just fast, consecutive rocks and roots, and the bike was very controllable. That's one of the things about these slacker bikes, to me, being 29-inch wheels, having slacker geometry, and really good suspension just allows you to be in control. I mean, all of us hit those sections where you just feel like the bike's going to skip out. Maybe you hit a rock the wrong direction, or you come around a corner and you just start to slip out on something. You can really bring the bike back into control. And that's what I love about bikes like this, is you can just kind of let it go more in the descents and really just focus on having fun versus, you know, trying to control the bike. This bike could be an enduro race bike. If you're not doing just super gnarly technical enduro races, it's like I said, it's an all-arounder. It's one of those bikes you can take up in the mountains, and it'll get you up the climbs without too much of a fuss, and you've got an amazing bike on the downhills. Now, I will say that if where you ride most often is more smooth, flowy stuff, you've got better options like the Spur or even the Smuggler. This bike is more designed for when your trails get pretty rough. The Smuggler is a bike that I've demoed before too, and that's another one that is just really good as an all-arounder. It's designed more for if you don't ride super, rough type terrain. Most of the stuff that I was riding up here in North Georgia, I think the Smuggler would have been a really good choice, but there were some downhills that I hit on this bike where I was really glad I had the travel. So who is this bike for? Well, it's for someone who just wants an all-arounder in the mountains. If you live in the foothills, if you ride more cross-country, I wouldn't recommend this bike. I feel like the steep seat tube angle is just not the best choice if you're riding, like I said, more XC stuff where you're doing a lot of pedaling, a lot of flatter stuff or rolly or even just the flowy stuff. I think the Smuggler is the better choice, or the Spur. The Spur is hands down one of my favorite bikes that I've ever owned. The only complaint that I could say on this bike is the rear tire clearance is pretty small. This has a 2.4, and this is as big as you can go. Even a 2.4, there's not a ton of room for mud clearance. So just want to throw that out there. If you ride in really muddy terrain and you have this bike, I'd probably put on like a 2.3. And speaking of tires, that's one thing that you can do on this bike if you want to put on some smaller tires and make it faster on the climbs. And now it's nice having the big tires on the descents when it gets pretty rough. But if you don't need that, but you still want a bike like this, that's a great all-arounder in the mountains, I would say put on some tires that are a little bit smaller. So that's going to wrap up my review of version 3 of the Transition Sentinel. They've made some really, really good changes that I'm happy about, because like I said, version 2 was a bit too slack for my taste. This bike just, for my riding style, feels better on the descent. So questions or comments, drop those below. If you've ridden this bike, let us know your thoughts. Do you agree, disagree with some of my analysis of version 3 of the Sentinel? Let us know. Catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.